Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Gephardt. I'm one of the rangers at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. You've all come here to hear a lot about General U.S. Grant running for president in 1868. So in the course of doing this, the research for this talk, what I have to confess is that there's not a whole lot to say about exactly what U.S. Grant had to say for this election. The three major sources that I used were Alexander Frick, a biography of Samuel Tilden, that was published in 1935. Charles Coleman wrote a book, a doctoral thesis actually, in 1933 on the election of 1868 from the Democratic Party point of view. And then finally I used a more recent work published in 2017 by Charles Calhoun. He's a noted historian of the Gilded Age, and that is called The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And that's part of a series that's being produced by the University of Kansas Press. So I decided that I would title this talk, Let Us Have Peace. These words are at the conclusion of Ulysses S. Grant's acceptance letter in July of 1868. And they sum up his appeal and his hope for the nation 4 years after the Civil War. Let us have peace. The backdrop of 4 years of violence in the South, resentments, military occupation, political division between Democrats and Republicans, controversies over the various forms of money that had been created because of the war, and finally the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The two most prominent political issues of that day were clearly the money question and Reconstruction. And of these, Reconstruction was the issue that both parties chose to emphasize. Now, U.S. Grant, general in the U.S. Army, many regarded him at the time, of course, as the savior of the Union, right? He's right up there with Abraham Lincoln as the savior of the Union. He was no politician. So how did he become the Republican nominee for president in 1868? I think it's safe to say that Grant was the ideal candidate for all stripes of Republicans because he was the living symbol of the Union victory over the Confederacy. However, President Andrew Johnson's relationship with Grant and Grant's relationship with the radical Republicans in Congress were factors in Grant's rise. So here's some background. What happened under President Johnson? Of course, Johnson was a lifelong Democrat who, like most Republicans at the time, wanted to punish that class of Southern whites who had brought on the war. He was a poor white by birth, and he resented the power of the planter class in the South. Johnson also wanted to readmit the Southern states to the Union, much in the same way that Lincoln did, as quickly and as mildly as possible. He required, like Lincoln, a loyalty oath, and he wanted to bar high officials from the Confederacy from any role in state governments that would be formed unless they would later be granted pardons by himself. Otherwise, white Southerners were permitted to be elected to new state governments under Johnson's plan, and the constitutions which were formed as a result of Johnson's plan did accept the end of slavery in the South. However, and this is a big sticking point, Johnson's governments did not provide for any political rights for blacks. This just was not considered. And this did not sit well with radical Republicans in Congress. They wanted a complete change in the political, economic structure of the South, change that included giving blacks political and civil rights. They were aware that right after the Civil War, right after the freeing of the slaves, Southern states began creating black codes which restricted the political rights of blacks, which prevented them from voting, which limited their abilities to move about freely, to perhaps get various kinds of jobs which they were seeking. And radical Republicans thought this was absolutely the wrong way to go. In terms of Johnson, he further alienated the radicals when he vetoed the Second Freedmen's Bureau Bill in 1866. And then in the midterm elections of that year, Johnson took a swing around the circle, during which he repeatedly lambasted radicals in a bid for political control. So he went around the country on this swing around the circle, and he engaged in all kinds of debates, shouting matches with hecklers at various rallies that he attended. And he took Ulysses S. Grant with him because he knew that Grant was very popular, and he essentially wanted to ride on the popularity that Grant provided him. So Grant is witness to these shouting matches which Andrew Johnson is engaging in, and he's absolutely appalled. And he comes to have doubts about Johnson's ability to serve as president, to lead the nation. So he's very much critical of Johnson at this juncture. Of course, in 1866, largely because of the bad press that Johnson got, and because the country's mood, the northern section of the country's mood, was really in favor of what the radical Republicans were after, they triumphed. They increased their majorities in Congress, and they essentially were able to box Johnson in and make him completely ineffective for the remainder of his term. In 1867, when the new Congress met, beginning in early March, they began passing a number of Reconstruction Acts. They completely wiped out Johnson's plan. They got rid of state governments that were established under Johnson's plan, and they substituted a new plan. This included creating 5 military districts in the old Confederacy and providing for military control over elections, which would do 2 things: create new state constitutions, which would grant political rights, civil rights to blacks, and elect officials who would make sure that that happened. At the same time, to box Johnson in, the Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. And this was designed to limit Johnson's ability to remove cabinet officers who had been appointed by his predecessor, Abraham Lincoln. The radicals knew exactly what they were up against because they knew that Johnson and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, were at odds. And Johnson was at odds with Stanton because Stanton was clearly in alignment with the radicals and was willing to do their bidding in terms of creating these new state governments under new constitutions that would recognize black political and civil rights. And so Johnson is basically being baited, I think we could say, by the radical Republicans in Congress. It wasn't very long before Johnson decided to remove Stanton from office. And he did this during a congressional recess, and he appointed Grant as the acting Secretary of War. Johnson wanted to challenge the Tenure of Office Act before the Supreme Court. He appointed Grant, believing that Grant would remain in office until such a challenge was heard and ruled upon. Now, Grant had his doubts about accepting this office, but according to his biographer, William McFeely, he took the office as a way of positioning himself for the presidency in 1868. Now, saying that is to also invite this idea that Grant actually didn't want to become president, but he believed that it was his duty to become president given the current political circumstances. So he's in service to the country during the Civil War to preserve the Union, and now after the Civil War, he is making himself available to become president because he sees himself as the logical person to fill the office, especially given that Johnson is making such a bad job of it. So you can look at this idea that Grant is going to become president, I think, from a couple of different perspectives. He'll do it because he thinks it's his duty. And so he accepts this office, Secretary of War, temporarily, because he thinks that that's going to burnish his reputation and make him all but inevitable as the Republican nominee. Congress, of course, refused to go along with the firing of Stanton. And Grant decided after that he could not remain in office. So he vacated his position as Secretary of War, and this caused a permanent rupture between Grant and Johnson. And again, Grant believed that Johnson lacked the dignity and the temperament to be president. Grant also came to believe more and more that the radical Republicans were right, that blacks had to be given political and civil rights, even though he himself, like many white Northerners, had his doubts about whether all blacks should be granted the privilege to vote. So Johnson was impeached in the spring of 1868 because of that violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Grant was repeatedly approached by members of the press to get a statement, and he absolutely refused to comment about it. But privately, among friends, he said that he believed that Johnson should be impeached or that he should resign. He simply had no use for Andrew Johnson. Of course, Johnson was acquitted by the Senate on May 26th by a margin of 1 vote. That's 5 days. Now, 5 days earlier, on May 21st, Grant was nominated by the Republican Party at its Chicago convention. So what were the issues in 1868? Again, one was the money issue, and the other was Reconstruction in the South. By far, the most important question was Reconstruction. This was the question, the issue on which the election depended. But the money question had influence in determining who would be the nominee of the Democratic Party. So what was the money question? During the war period, the federal government created a class of paper money called greenbacks. They were not backed by gold, but they were legal tender. There was also specie, or hard currency, gold coins, and banknotes backed by gold as well. And part of the financing of the war was the issuance of interest-bearing bonds that were sold and could be redeemed after a period of years. And sometimes, in many cases, those bonds were issued with the promise that they would be redeemed both in principal and in interest in gold. But not all of those bonds, not all of those bond issues were issued with the promise of gold payment. So after the war, the questions became, should the greenbacks be eliminated? And if not, should the greenbacks be used in the payment of the interest and the principal on bonds? And this is just part of the issue, but the part of the issue that I thought we should focus on for today's talk. One view concerning greenbacks was that by expanding them, the money supply would be increased. Farmers and others in the West and Midwest would be able to make purchases more easily and pay off debts more easily. The counter opinion was that paper money was in and of itself dishonest, a thing of no value. It was inflationary and therefore damaging to the economy. Then there was a third point of view, if you will, or a third idea regarding paying bonds in paper. And it was simply this. Many bonds were bought using paper money, using greenbacks. So there's nothing unjust about paying interest or paying the principal in greenbacks later on. So there are a lot of ideas and issues surrounding this money question. But again, in 1868, both the Democrats and the Republicans downplay it. Reconstruction, this was the issue of the campaign. And again, why is this so controversial? Well, first of all, we know that President Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress had clashed for 3 years over how the southern states would be brought back into the Union. Reconstruction touched on constitutional issues. 1, under whose authority would the former Confederate states be admitted? The executive branch or the legislative branch? 2, were the military districts established by the Congress constitutional? Was this permitted under the Constitution? 3, the Constitution as written in 1787 granted to the states the authority to decide who was qualified to vote. But the new Congress in 1867, through the Reconstruction Acts and through the creation of the 14th Amendment, forced the southern states to grant suffrage to blacks as a condition of readmission to the Union. And this was a point of contention, a great point of contention between state politicians in the South and federal politicians. Reconstruction touched on political and moral issues. Who should vote? Most whites, North and South, had their doubts about the qualifications of blacks to vote. There were all kinds of ideas, some saying that blacks simply were not, by nature, qualified to understand the functionings of a democratic republic, of government, and therefore they're not qualified to vote. Other opinions would range from blacks fought in the Civil War for the Union to preserve the Union, and therefore, having sacrificed their lives or potentially sacrificed their lives, of course, they deserve a right in deciding who shall lead the country. There was the idea that only intelligent, or the most intelligent among the black race, should be qualified to vote. That perhaps we should have a property qualification for blacks to vote. An ability to read and write. I lost the word. At any rate, you get the idea. So there are various opinions about who should vote, whether blacks should vote or not. This, of course, this attitude about education was also applied to immigrants at the time. The converse idea here is that if the southern states refused to grant the freed people political and civil rights, including the right to vote, then what was the point of ending slavery, a major goal of the Union and a major result of the war? What are you going to do with these people? Are you going to keep them in a permanent state of vassalage? Or are you going to give them the opportunity to become fully citizens of the country? So this is a political, a moral issue. Reconstruction also had concerns about social order. In 1866 and 1867, throughout the South, blacks and white Republicans were attacked by mobs and were intimidated at the polls. In May of 1867, riots broke out in Memphis, Tennessee. White policemen fired on black soldiers, and as a result, 50 blacks, 2 whites were killed. There was looting, there was arson. In July of the same year in New Orleans, during the convention to ratify a new constitution for that state, violence erupted, and again, police shot at blacks. Under radical Reconstruction, blacks could run for office and hold office, but federal troops were used to ensure that blacks could vote. And of course, this went against the grain of a lot of white people in the South. We have military occupation. We have people from the North, essentially, or at the North's bidding, controlling the political situation in the South. Very, very controversial. the former white leadership of the various southern states were determined to regain control of the political situation and to prevent what they called Negro domination. And the enforcement of black voting rights led to the creation of many organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But again, the question is, was the federal government to stand by as violence erupted throughout the South against blacks and white Republicans? So now we're going to come to the Democratic nominees, or rather the Democratic candidates, in 1868. So, do some identification here. This is George Pendleton of Ohio, Gentleman George. Salmon Chase, former Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, currently the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Andrew Johnson, President of the United States. Winfield Scott Hancock, who would become the Democratic nominee in 1880, was a contender in 1868 and again in 1876. This is Thomas Hendricks of Indiana. And finally, Horatio Seymour of New York, former governor. Does anybody other than Todd know who the eventual winner of the nomination was? Okay, good. The Democrats were divided over the money question. George Pendleton was the leading candidate going into the convention. In 1867, he was the author of the Ohio idea, which was to pay the principal and interest of bonds in greenbacks unless payment in gold was specified in the original bond offering. After all, again, many bonds had been purchased with paper, so there's nothing wrong with paying interest and principal back in paper. Pendleton argued that the retention of greenbacks would expand the money supply in the Midwest and West and allow for purchases and payments of debts as the post-war economy was slowing. Thomas Hendricks agreed with him. Chase and Seymour were hard money men. They believed that our money supply should be based on gold and nothing but gold, that it was of value, that it was honest money. But again, this is not the issue that the campaign is going to run on. However, in the Democratic platform, the Ohio idea was endorsed. Democrats, of course, were uniformly opposed to the Reconstruction Acts passed by the radical Republicans in 1867. They opposed the establishment of military districts in the South. They opposed granting civil and political rights to blacks. They opposed the prohibition of political participation by former leaders of the Confederacy, and they noted the hypocrisy of Northern politicians, of radical Republicans, who insisted that blacks must be granted the right to vote in the South, while in the North, many states did not allow blacks to vote. And among those states, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Blacks could not vote in 1866, 67, 68. Military occupation and Negro domination. These were the great fears of the Democrats. Pendleton expressed the view that if blacks were committed to the care of whites, there would be no more injustice than that women were secure under the guidance of men. Hendricks believed in qualified suffrage, blacks who had fought for the Union or who were literate or who were at least worth $250. Seymour said that the qualifications of blacks to vote or not vote was not the issue. In his view, the issue was the federal government's intrusion on states' rights to decide who will or will not be voters. Of the potential Democratic candidates, only Chase was in favor of suffrage for blacks. His basic view was that there should be a universal right by all blacks, males, 21 and older, to vote. But he was willing to go along with the idea of qualified voting. That is to say, there's a literacy test, there's a property test, that sort of thing. But again, coming back to Chase, being originally a Democrat before he was ever a Republican and now reverting back to the Democratic Party, he's also a states' rights man. So he'll say on one hand, well, I believe in universal suffrage for black people, but this is really a states' rights matter. So he's kind of waffling a little bit. The Democratic Convention was held at New York's Tammany Hall on July the 4th. It opened on July the 4th, and Horatio Seymour was the chair of the convention. The platform, adopted on July 6th, had four main highlights. The recognition that secession and slavery were closed questions. The Democratic Party favored the immediate restoration of the states to all their rights in the Union, meaning that they believed in a civil government, not military government. They believed in the amnesty for all past political offenses, and they believed that the states should regulate who gets to vote. And finally, again, they endorsed the Ohio idea, George Pendleton's idea, of expanding the money supply with greenbacks and allowing for the repayment of debts using that lawful money. And it was lawful. It was legal money, paper money. It was legal money at the time. At the same time that the Democrats were meeting, a soldiers' convention was held on the same day at Cooper's Union in New York. And this was composed of a number of Democratic military men who were opposed to the idea of Ulysses S. Grant becoming president. They favored Winfield Scott Hancock. The balloting for the nominee. Now, most presidential nominations in the 19th century were achieved after a lot of bartering for votes. We are used to the idea that when the convention meets, it's a done deal. The nominee is nominated on the first ballot. Since 1956, every nominee of either major party has been nominated on the first ballot. In the 19th century, that was not the case as a rule. Nominations were won after multiple ballots. This was the case for the Democrats in 1868. Pendleton led the balloting for the first 8 ballots. And again, the platform endorsed his Ohio idea. But after the 8th ballot, the hard money men in the convention, particularly Samuel Tilden of New York, he was a leader, began to whittle away at Pendleton's majority, or not majority, but his large vote. By the 18th ballot, it looked like Hancock was going to be the nominee, but then Thomas Hendricks led for the next 3 ballots. And at this point, the Ohio and New York delegations swung to former New York Governor Horatio Seymour. He was nominated on the 22nd ballot. Now here's a fun point to be made. Throughout the convention, even before the convention started, Horatio Seymour kept saying, I do not want to be the nominee of the party. But various forces coalesced to make him the nominee. So imagine that. Someone being nominated for the presidency who doesn't want to be president, but that's exactly what happened in 1868. He also, again, being a hard money man, was very much opposed to the plank in the Democratic platform that endorsed greenbacks. Samuel Tilden of New York essentially had to persuade him to accept the nomination and go from there. The vice presidential nominee was Frank Blair of Missouri, brother of Montgomery, who served in Lincoln's cabinet, and son of Preston Blair, who had been a top advisor to President Jackson in the 1830s. Frank Blair was a one-time anti-slavery Republican. He helped keep Missouri in the Union in the early days of the war, but he left the Republican Party over its handling of Reconstruction. In a letter to Colonel James O. Broadhead of Missouri, he stated his opposition to, quote, the working of Negro suffrage by grace of the sword, unquote. And in the same letter, he said that President Johnson should refuse to enforce Reconstruction laws and should compel, these are his words, compel the Army to undo its usurpations in the South. His aggressive stand against radical Republican Reconstruction very likely cost him a number of votes. We're going to talk more about him in a few minutes. The Republican Convention. Here are the candidates. Actually, there were two others who were somewhat under consideration. The Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, and again, Salmon Chase. But Salmon Chase, for a number of reasons, was not favored by the Republicans. I'm going to say right now that a major reason that he would not have been able to get the Republican nomination that year was that during the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, he issued a number of rulings that actually were designed to help Johnson. And so a lot of Republicans were just not fond of Chase. So he is the Republican nominee. The convention, again, met on May 20th and 21st. The highlights of the platform for the Republicans included support for state constitutions guaranteeing equal civil and political rights for all, equal suffrage for all loyal men of the South, reserving the question of suffrage for blacks in the North to be decided by individual states. No repudiation of Confederate debts and the payment of all debts according to their original contract. So if those bond issues stipulate payment of interest in gold coin, then that's what we should be doing. And finally, that platform roundly condemned the administration of Andrew Johnson. And again, there was another soldiers' convention held in that city that supported the nomination of Ulysses S. Grant. Nominated on the first ballot, Grant won with 650 votes on May 21st. Again, the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, was nominated for the vice presidency. And Grant was, as noted at the beginning of the talk, the symbol of Union victory. And for Republicans also, he was favored for his known opposition to President Grant and for his desire, his willingness to cooperate with radical Republicans in Congress. So now we come to the campaign. There's a poster for Grant and Colfax. And I just picked this one out because I think it's fun. I don't know whether you can read this or not, but I'm going to read it for you because I just think it's a lot of fun. U.S. Grant, Schuyler Colfax, Grant and Colfax, Tanners, Washington, D.C. respectfully inform the people of the United States that they will be engaged in tanning old Democratic hides until after the 3rd day of November, 1868. The senior member of the firm, having considerable experience in the business, thinks that by the help of his partner, all work will be done in a satisfactory manner. References General Buckner, General Robert E. Lee, and General Pendleton. So I just thought that was kind of fun. Here are the Democratic candidates, Seymour and Blair. Like today, the parties and the press diverted voters' attention from serious political matters to assaults on the characters of the candidates. And to give you just two examples, the Republicans noted that there was a strain of insanity running through the family of Horatio Seymour. And the Democrats touted the much reported and supposed weakness for the bottle of U.S. Grant. More consequentially, I think, in terms of Seymour, he was faulted for not resisting secession in 1861, for a grudging support for the Union while he was governor of New York, and for openly opposing Lincoln's call for a draft in 1863. And again, we come to General Blair there, his strident language in attacking military government in the South. The New York Tribune editorialized as the adoption by the United States of a government of assassination, by assassination, and violence, instead of a government by law. So that Broadhead letter in which he declared his opposition to radical Republican Reconstruction, to the idea that blacks were being given the vote at the point of a sword, this was highly controversial, and he was roundly criticized in much of the northern press throughout the election campaigns. But he would say, Blair would say, that he's not the revolutionary. No, it's the radical Republicans who are the revolutionaries, because they're the ones who are establishing military government over civil government in the South. And that's unconstitutional. That's revolutionary. Seymour and the Democrats opposed military rule and Negro domination. Grant and the Republicans insisted on military rule to ensure black rights and the growth of the Republican Party in the South. Now, in this period, 1868, it is not the custom for presidential candidates to actually go out and campaign. Once they're nominated, they were expected to write a letter of acceptance which outlined their views on various issues. This was published in the newspapers, and then essentially they're supposed to take a back seat. Stay at home, out of view. Don't get involved. Don't pander for votes. Be quiet. Other politicians, other party workers, Democrats, Republicans, would campaign for them. So Grant took no active part in the campaign. The one thing that he did, other than remaining in Galena, Illinois, was he went on a tour of the Great Plains to Army forts with Generals Sheridan and Sherman. He declined all requests to speak about anything political during that tour. And again, Seymour did the same thing. He remained in New York until October. Good speakers, white and black. Good speakers, that was the term. Good speakers, white and black, were hired to campaign for Grant in the North, in the South. Of course, only white speakers campaigned for Seymour and Blair. Barbecues, parades, these were typical. Campaign badges, all kinds of paraphernalia to support one's candidate. This was common. In the South, a combination of persuasion and intimidation was used toward blacks and white Republicans. Toward blacks, promises by Democrats to support qualified Negro suffrage, or intimidation, a refusal to hire blacks who were considering voting Republican. As far as white Republicans go, notable Democrat from Georgia, Howell Cobb, urged that white Republicans be socially ostracized. And again, Democrats note the hypocrisy of Northern Republicans in that there's no black suffrage in many northern states. In the 19th century, several state elections were held in September and October, and these were considered bellwethers for the November national elections. In 1868, 9 states held state elections: Vermont, California, Maine, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Iowa, West Virginia, and Ohio. Only in California did the Democrats win. Soon, there were calls within the Democratic Party that either Seymour or Blair or both be replaced by Chase, by Johnson, by Hendricks, by Hancock. So the Democrats find themselves in a bit of a panic by the middle of October. These calls, of course, were not heeded. Seymour decided to break with tradition. He went on a tour of the country that included a number of major eastern and midwestern cities, including Buffalo, Chicago, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. He denounced Republicans for their attacks on Andrew Johnson. He said that radical republicanism was oppressive, radical Reconstruction was oppressive to the South, and it was costly. There's one estimate that the federal government was spending $150 million a year to keep order in the South in these years prior to 1868. He said that radical Republicans had created a situation where it was absolutely necessary to return to constitutional government, to make the states equal before the federal government. And he also insisted that there must be civil authority over military authority. So here's our final slide. And this shows the electoral map for 1868. I thought this was a really fun map, or interesting map, in that it really gives you an idea of what was the United States in 1868, right? All of this area is territory, but they're not voting in 1868 for president. And there's something else that's kind of interesting about this map. Can anybody see what it is? Virginia, what about Virginia? Wasn't part of the election. Hadn't been readmitted to the Union yet. Neither was Mississippi. Neither was Texas. They did not participate. Their votes were not counted in the election of 1868. 1872, they were all back in the Union. 1868, they still are not in the Union. So Election Day was November 3rd. Again, the Electoral College, it's a rout for Grant. He won 214 votes to Seymour's 80. However, given all the problems of the Democrats, they create a platform that the nominee does not entirely agree with, and the nominee doesn't even really want to be the nominee. Despite all that, in terms of the popular vote, it was surprisingly close. It was 52 and a fraction percent. I should have noted that before, and I didn't. And versus 47. In terms of raw numbers, 3 million for Grant, 2,700,000 rounding numbers. 2,700,000 for Seymour and Blair. So this was a close election in terms of the popular vote. Now, some historians will say, well, if there hadn't been a lot of voter fraud in the South and had blacks and white Republicans not been intimidated from voting, then Grant's margin would have been larger. But then other historians will point out, well, if Virginia and Mississippi and Texas had been participating in the election, it's very possible that Seymour could have won. So I think that's a really interesting thing to ponder. That here we are, 1868, it's Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the war, right, the living symbol of Union victory. And I won't say that he eked out, he didn't eke out a victory exactly, but you would think it would be a lot less close. But it really tells you something about the divisions within the country, and obviously the South is not going along with the North in terms of Reconstruction. And so this is a surprisingly close election in terms of the popular votes. But those results in 1868 confirmed radical Republican control of Reconstruction for the next 4 years. Their totals in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House were increased. They elected, the Republicans elected, we might as well say maybe the radical Republicans elected, the living symbol of union as President of the United States. The phrase, "let us have peace," elected U.S. Grant to the presidency. But peace remained elusive in the South as military rule continued there. The money issue would not be resolved for years. New concerns about good government, increasing immigration, and the industrialization of the economy began to compete for the attention of the public with the older issues related to the legacy of the Civil War, particularly race and equality. And I would just conclude with this thought, that what happened in 1868, we continue to live with that legacy to this very day. We're still debating this issue of race and equality in 2018. So there is the election of 1868. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, sir?
I was curious about Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Were they not admitted because the failure of the state assemblies to accept the burdens that the North was putting on them, or was it the North who just didn't accept them back in?
They had not yet accepted, and something I did not mention in the talk was first of all, they weren't going along with the 14th Amendment, and then there was a proposed, at this point, there's a proposed 15th Amendment, which will absolutely guarantee nationwide that blacks will have the vote. That gets ratified in 1870, but it's in the wind. And those southern states, those three states, they still weren't going along. So they had not created state governments that yet permitted them to be readmitted to the Union. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions or yes, sir?
What happened to George McClellan? In 1864, he didn't do badly in running for president.
Right. Apparently he's not a factor. I didn't read anything about him in my research that pointed that he was even a factor in 1868. And I know that he went on later, and I don't know exactly when. To be quite honest, your question is just making me think a little bit here. He went on later to become governor of New Jersey, but I'm not quite sure exactly when that was. But I'm assuming that he simply wasn't interested, wasn't a factor. The fact that he had lost in 1864 may have been kind of disqualifying for him in 1868. But I really don't know. I didn't come across his name in any meaningful way. Anything else? Yes, sir?
Andrew Johnson, his involvement in the convention, and was there any support for him being nominated?
He was not involved in the convention, and there really was no solid support for Andrew Johnson. And the reasons for that really have to do with the impeachment, which just destroyed his reputation within the Democratic Party. But I think also that swing around the circle in 1866, I don't want to be too harsh, but I think one could argue that he made a fool of himself in 1866, or his performance in 1866 in that swing around the circle was just greeted with so much criticism that it undercut him. I mean, the fact that the radical Republicans triumph in those mid-year elections show right there he's a weakened president in 1866. Then he gets impeached in 1868. Why in the world would the Democrats continue to back him? So that would be my answer to you. Okay. And yes, sir.
Lincoln was a Republican.
Beg your pardon?
Lincoln was a Republican.
Yes.
But Andrew Johnson
was a Democrat.
They ran
on the Union ticket in 1864, and the idea was that Andrew Johnson, being a Union Democrat, the only Democratic U.S. senator to remain in Congress after all those southern states seceded, including Tennessee, which he represented. He's the only one who remained in Congress. So he is a symbol of union, a democratic unionism. And the idea was that he would draw Democrats to vote to re-elect Abraham Lincoln. And again, as I think we know, in 1864, there was a lot of controversy about Lincoln even being renominated by the Republican Party. So having Andrew Johnson on the ticket was the idea, I think, of some insurance that Lincoln's going to get reelected because we're going to get Democratic support. Union Democrats, right? War Democrats, they're going to support Lincoln. Over McClellan, who wanted to basically sue for peace and go back to slavery in the South, that's fine, just as long as we're all reunited as a nation. So that's a powerfully divisive situation in 1864. Johnson's put on the ticket to help Lincoln. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes.
Was Johnson actually Lincoln's choice also?
No. And that's another I think that's another, shall I say, misunderstanding? I don't know. In the 19th century, vice presidential candidates, by and large, were not picked by the presidential candidate. They were picked by the convention. They were picked for a number of political reasons. Geographical balance, ideological balance, that sort of thing. So Johnson was not his choice, but Lincoln went along with it. He did not voice strong preference to retain Hannibal Hamlin, who was the vice president in 1864. Lincoln didn't strongly say, oh, I want Hamlin. So he let the convention decide, and the convention decided on Johnson, and Lincoln went along with it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Colfax, was he a military leader, and what happened to him?
He was not a military leader. He was the Speaker of the House in 1868. He represented the state of Indiana. He got involved in a political scandal which also touched on James Garfield's career. It was called the Crédit Mobilier, or Credit Mobilier, American pronunciation, scandal, in which he received some payments from a dummy company set up by the Union Pacific. That scandal essentially finished Colfax's career. He was the vice president when all this broke out. He was not renominated for vice president in 1872. And his political career was essentially over. He died in 1885. He died in 1885. Yeah, so that's what I can tell you about him. That's what I, off the top of my head, remember about him. So yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Did the blacks have could they choose him or
Choose who?
the two candidates?
Could they vote for? Could they vote? They voted in some places in the South. They voted in some places in the North. I mentioned states that did not allow Negro suffrage in the North. Those that did allow Negro suffrage, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. New York had a qualified privilege for voting for blacks, which was $250 worth of wealth. So there was qualified voting for blacks in New York, most of New England. I don't recall any other states prior to 1868 where that was allowed. Now, again, just to give a little background here, was it Minnesota, Wisconsin, and I believe Iowa, in 1868, passed laws to allow for it. I'm not sure that it was operative as of 1868, but in those three states, in 1868, that was provided for. So again, does that answer the question? Yes, there was black voting in the country. Yeah, there was some in the South, but again, this situation in the South where blacks are being constantly intimidated, and they're psychologically intimidated and also physically intimidated. I gave you some examples of riots in which blacks were killed, a few whites were killed. This went on throughout the 1860s and 1870s. where blacks and white Republicans were repeatedly attacked, killed, maimed, intimidated. So I can't give you off the top of my head a lot of statistics about how many blacks in South Carolina, or how many blacks in Arkansas, what have you, but there were blacks who voted. Don't know that they all voted Republican either, right? I do not believe, and again, this would be something that I would like to actually, and meant to just kind of go over. In this period, there's not the registration process for voters that there is today. So people show up at the polls and they vote. And they might go to a different polling place and vote again. Or they might come back a couple of hours later and vote again. So that, and that kind of thing is why we have voter registration laws today. But it hadn't been set up in 1868. So that kind of idea that we really have to clean this up is in part growing out of all this controversy over who gets to vote, particularly in the South, but again, in the North as well. Now, Ohio allowed for black voting. I think it was March 3rd, 1870 was when the law went into effect. Well, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed black voting nationwide, went into effect in 1870. So Ohio is just finally going along with what is inevitable, that there will be black suffrage. Of course, again, as the 1870s and 1880s proceed, there are all kinds of ways in which blacks are denied the right to vote because the Supreme Court invalidates a lot of the Reconstruction era legislation that permitted them to vote, and states are allowed to create all kinds of qualifications. And that's a way to deny black people in the South to vote. And so what's happening 80 years later, 90 years later, in our lifetimes, in the 1950s and 1960s. And it's all because of what's going on in the 1870s. So, yes, ma'am.
And they don't have secret ballots yet either, right?
No, that's right. There are no secret ballots at that time. That's right. Anything else? All right, well, I guess that's it.